Thanks, Meta. It's fun to be here. So basically what I'm going to do tonight is to give you an overview of some of the things. I published a book a few years ago called The Ethics of Immigration, so I'm going to give you a sense of what I talked about in that book. And I don't know, it's science for peace, so I don't know how many of you are scientists and how many of you are not. But so I'm a political philosopher, and I write about what, not about what is, but about what ought to be. That's one of the differences. Or for those of you, I see some of you are of my generation, and some are Americans, so they'll recognize that Robert F. Kennedy used to say, "Some see things as they are and ask why. Others dream dreams that never were and ask why not." So I'm in the second category. I'm the one who asks why not. Okay, so what about immigration? What are the ethical issues raised by immigration? And I'm going to give an overview, as I say. But I'm going to concentrate on what I take to be the three most controversial issues that I talk about in the book. The first is, how should we treat irregular migrants, that is, people who've settled in our country without authorization? The second is, what are our moral responsibilities towards refugees? And the third is, are we really morally justified in restricting immigration at all? Okay, and so just to set a little bit of context for this, in asking these questions, I'm talking about the moral duties and rights of people in rich North American states in responding to refugees. So there is a question about the extent to which what I say here would apply to people who live in other countries. I think much of it does, but that requires another kind of argument, so we're just bracketing that for tonight. And second, where do I get my moral views from? Well, I'm starting from what I call a commitment to democratic principles. And now what that entails depends on how you interpret democratic principles, of course, but what I'm saying, and what I say could be contested, you might disagree with my reading of democratic principles, but if you're somebody who says, well, I don't believe in democracy, these arguments are not going to be very persuasive to you. So I just kind of take that as a starting point. I'm happy to talk with people who don't believe in democracy too, but that's a different conversation. So what do I mean by that? Well, it's just kind of commonsensical term. I mean, broad moral commitments that undergird and justify contemporary political institutions and policies throughout North America and Europe. Things like the idea that all human beings are of equal moral worth, that disagreements should normally be resolved through the principle of majority rule, that we have a duty to respect the rights and freedoms of individuals, that legitimate government depends upon the consent of the governed, that all citizens should be equal under the law, that coercion should only be exercised in accordance with the rule of law, that people shouldn't be subject to discrimination in basis of characteristics like race, religion, or gender, that we should respect norms like fairness and reciprocity in our practices. Things like that, which most people at least pay lip service to. That's not to say these things are always respected in practice, we know that, but most people, you always have to qualify this these days after the Donald Trump phenomenon, but most people think you have to announce that you're committed to these sorts of values and principles. So even though you can get, there are conflicts among these principles, people can disagree with what they mean, but on a wide range of topics. Say, again, I always used to be able to say this with confidence that everybody would agree with this, but so I say, is it morally acceptable to force someone to convert from one religion to another? Almost everybody would say, no, you can't do that. Now again, today, you have to qualify that a bit, but still, by and large, that's the consensus. Nobody openly says you can compel people to convert. So there's no serious disagreement among those who think of themselves as Democrats about that sort of question. And many of the questions raised by immigration are interconnected, and I'm going to try to show you that if you accept this commitment to democratic principles, that it'll constrain the answers you can give to these questions about immigration. And third, and this will seem a little puzzling, for most of my talk, the first 2/3 of it or so, I'm going to assume that states normally have a moral right to exercise discretionary control over immigration, to decide who gets in and who doesn't. Now, I'm going to qualify that in various ways in talking about, that's what I call the conventional view. That's what most people think, that we're entitled, Canadians get to decide who comes into Canada, Americans get to decide who comes in the United States, and so on. French decide who gets come into France. Some qualifications, but most people think that's the rule. In the final part of the talk, I'll raise questions about that. I'll say, well, maybe not. But for the first part of it, I'm assuming that. Okay. I'm going to skip some stuff, which I think is kind of more technical. So let me turn to questions about people I call irregular migrants. The people who support these people call them the undocumented. People who don't like them call them illegal immigrants. I use the term irregular migrants because I want to have an argument. I don't want to just presuppose the answer in the definition, right? So I think undocumented is too, which is ultimately where I come out, is prejudices the case in terms of the way it's defined. So I want to ask questions about the moral claims that such people have without building the answer to my questions into the name itself. Okay. So remember, I'm assuming here that the state normally has a right to control immigration. So it follows from that states are morally entitled to deport irregular migrants if they apprehend them. Nevertheless, I want to claim that irregular migrants should enjoy most of the civil, economic, and social rights that other people enjoy. And furthermore, the state should normally create a firewall between the enforcement of immigration laws on the one hand and the protection of the legal rights of irregular migrants on the other. And finally, I'm going to argue that over time, irregular migrants acquire a moral right to remain, which ought to be recognized in law, even though they have arrived without permission. So how do I do this? Well, at first blush, I often get they're illegal immigrants. They don't have any rights. And so people will say that sometimes, but nobody actually thinks that, right? Because we're not any longer in the Middle. In the Middle Ages, it was true. If you were an outlaw, it meant you had no protection. Anyone could do anything to you. They could kill you, they could rob you, they could beat you up, and you had no protection from the law. But nobody, whether people believe it or not, again, this is something that nobody announces that today. No state practices that. No matter how you've come, whether you're here with permission or not, you're entitled not to be assaulted, not to be robbed, not to be killed. You have certain basic rights, basic human rights, which everybody who's in a state is supposed to have protected, regardless of their immigration status. And again, at least at the level of formality, everybody recognizes that. But the fact that people are entitled to certain legal rights don't mean that they're actually able to make use of these rights. So irregular migrants are so worried about coming to the attention of the authorities, they're often reluctant to pursue the legal protections and remedies to which they're formally entitled. So if you're an irregular migrant and you get assaulted, will you go to the police? Well, probably not. You're afraid the police are going to turn you into the immigration authorities. If you're hurt, will you go to the emergency room and get medical treatment? Well, you might be reluctant to do that because you're worried you'll get turned into the immigration authorities. So you've got these basic rights on paper, but you don't have them in practice. So that doesn't seem right. If we're serious about protecting these basic rights, we ought to make sure that people are able actually to exercise them. So how do we do that? Well, the answer is you build a firewall between the protection of basic rights, the people who have charge of that, hospital workers, police, teachers, people who are responsible for protecting basic rights on the one hand, and people whose job it is to enforce immigration laws on the other. And you don't allow communication from the people who are supposed to protect basic rights about the status of the people they're serving to the immigration officials. Now, when I say this, some people think, and so the idea there is we announce these rights, let's make them actually effective. Some people say, you can't do that. You can't expect, these were all state officials. How can you possibly expect them not to communicate with one another? But in fact, we do this all the time. So think about, so I'm not sure about the law in Canada, but in the US, I'm certain about this, in the Internal Revenue Service. So if you, no matter what your income is, even if obtained illegally, you have to report it to the Internal Revenue Service. So you might think, but wait a minute, why won't they just tell the cops about it and you'll get arrested? Well, because they're required not to. It's a formal law, and it actually works. This is how they got Al Capone, as some of you will know, is that he didn't pay his income tax. They didn't get him on the breaking of the other laws. They got him on not reporting his income tax. And they attempted to defend him by saying, well, he's got a right not to report it because he's got a right against self-incrimination. And they said, no, because that can't be used against you. If you report your income tax, obtained illegally, they can't use that. If the police do get that information from the IRS, they can't use it in court. So that's just one common example. There are a lot of them about these firewalls where one set of officials has information which they are not allowed to transmit to another set of officials. Very common. So I'm saying that's what we ought to do with respect to immigrants and their basic rights. The people who are protecting the basic rights can't communicate information about the status of the immigrants to the people who are enforcing immigration law. And I think that applies. It certainly applies to basic human rights. It applies to a range of human rights. So, for example, children of irregular migrants have a basic right to go to school. They're not going to put their kids in school if the school authorities report the kids to the immigration officials. So they have to be protected. And in fact, they are in lots of cases. That's a rule in Canada and elsewhere. And there are a lot of cities that have adopted this. This firewall idea is actually reflected in a lot of practices that cities have adopted about how they deliver services to the people who live in the cities. Okay, so that's there are some other rights we could talk about. So for example, here's another example. Irregular migrants have jobs. Are they protected by the laws that say health and safety laws? Well, again, you have this problem that if they seek protection without this firewall, they'll get turned in. It's one of the things employers often do is they threaten to turn them in to the immigration authorities, right? So you have to have a rule that says that can't be done. You can't do that. And then those rights become effective, which is good not only for the irregular migrants, but also for the other workers whose rights are eroded if the irregular migrants' rights are not effective. So as the list grows, you might say, well, are there any rights that authorized immigrants have to which unauthorized immigrants are not entitled to? What's the good of getting authorized if you get all these rights? And the answer is, well, if you accept this initial assumption that states are normally morally entitled to receive the benefit to control borders, I guess I'd say this: irregular migrants are not normally there might be qualifications, not normally morally entitled to receive the benefits of income support programs. You need more money, or welfare, that sort of thing, and of course they're not morally entitled to stay under normal circumstances. But even those constraints are not absolute. So here's the second part of the argument is this. As time passes, irregular migrants do acquire a right to stay and to have their status regularized. And why is that? Well, what I want to say is the longer one stays in society, the stronger your claim to membership in that society, even someone who's settled without authorization. When people settle in a country, they form connections and attachments that generate strong moral claims over time. And after a while, the conditions of admission become irrelevant. So I know some people will be skeptical about this, so let me tell you the story about Margaret Grimmond. This is a true story. So Marguerite Grimmond was born in the United States, so she's an American citizen because she was born in the United States, and at the age of 4, her mother took her to Scotland. And there she spent her life and got married and had kids, and at the age of 80, Margaret Grimmond went on a family vacation to Australia. And in going on that vacation, she took out an American passport. So she knew she was an American citizen. She knew she wasn't a UK citizen. And she arrives back in the UK, and the immigration official says, "Hey, American passport. Oh, what are you doing here?" She says, "I live here." "You can't live here. You don't have a visa. You're an illegal immigrant," they said. "So you got to go back home to America." So I hasten to add, Granny Grimmond survived this ordeal, as you might expect. This became a big newspaper story, and everybody thought this was absurd, that they were going to send out this 80-year-old grandmother to the United States. But why? I mean, under the law, the immigration official, as they're often kind of highly bureaucratic, he was right about the law at one level, right? So why was it so everybody could see this was completely crazy? Well, it's a recognition that this person has spent her entire life in the country. It makes no sense to be sending her to someplace just because she happened to be born there at the age and lived there for her first 4 years, right? And everybody could see that in the case of Granny Grimmond, who, not accidentally, of course, was white and a pleasing picture to the public press. But the principle is the same. So would it have mattered if she was 60 or 40? How long do you have to stay before you get this kind of claim? And of course, it shouldn't matter either whether she was white or brown or yellow or red or kind of whatever color, right? So once you see that story, you see, well, yeah, time matters morally. And we have this idea in other areas as well. So think about the statute of limitations. If you commit a crime, you steal something, you rob somebody, not the most serious crimes, not rape or murder, but a lot of crimes, there's a statute of limitations. And if you're not apprehended and charged with that crime within a certain period of time, you can't be. So why is that? I mean, you did it. Why can't you be charged 20 years down the road for taking that book or doing whatever you did? Well, we've got this view that, it's not reasonable to expect people to live with the sword of Damocles over the head for these extended periods, So we just say that time matters. There are issues like this around property law as well, that, if you occupy a piece of property for a certain period of time and nobody challenges it, you wind up owning it, okay? So in these kinds of cases, what we recognize is that time matters morally. As time passes, people have claims because of their living circumstances, and that even when they've acquired those claims without authorization at the outset, the fact that time has passed matters. Okay. So by the way, this is the easiest case to make when you're talking about people who have arrived as children, as many irregular migrants have in Canada as well as in the United States. if they've arrived at a young age, they're basically been socialized. But even, and they are not responsible for having arrived. So that's an easy case to make. Most people recognize that.
Recently, Joe, there's a case in the States of Korean adoptees who've been sent back to Korea.
Right.
Whose parents who adopted them never actually acquired their citizenship.
So there are these quirks in the law.
It's very bizarre.
Yeah, it's absurd, but it's no more absurd than if the kid happened to arrive at the age of 2 and is then being sent back, right? So as an irregular migrant. So the case that Chloe's talking about is one in which there have been kids who have been adopted from abroad, in this case from Korea. The kid grows up, and the parents, as you know, who knows about immigration laws? You know, the parents didn't get the kid registered as a citizen. They probably thought it happened automatically. As I don't know what people often think I know about Canadian law and so on, which I don't. You know, so I don't know what the Canadian law is in this case. I think now when you get adopted, you get citizenship. So you would expect that would be a reasonable rule. You know, you're a member of the family and so on. But in the United States, it isn't, or it wasn't at the time. I'm not even sure what the current law is. So this kid grows up and then gets involved in some criminal activity. Often it's drugs, because you know lots of the convictions are around drugs thing, and then gets sent back to some country where he or she, it's usually a he, has never lived, doesn't know the language, doesn't know the people. This kind of deportation of people who have been convicted of crimes, regardless of how long they've stayed in the country, is one of the great scandals of the existing regime. And it's true in Canada as well as the United States, by the way, about the deportation of people who are convicted of crimes. No matter how long they've lived in Canada, they often get sent back to a place that they have no connection to. So that's a great scandal in my view. Okay, so that's irregular migrants. Now let's turn to questions about refugees. What responsibilities do those of us who live in rich democratic states have to admit people who flee their home states? So you think about Syria, of course, Iraq, Afghanistan, Bosnia, Sri Lanka, Rwanda, Congo, Darfur, just to mention some of the recent cases that have caused millions of people to flee their homes in a desperate effort to find safety. So do we have a responsibility to admit these refugees if they want to find a new home in one of our communities, one of these rich states in Europe and North America? Or are we justified in refusing them entry? Now, I always find it's helpful when you're thinking about refugees to remember that any contemporary discussion of refugees begins in the shadow of the Holocaust. So in discussing refugees, you should always remember one fundamental truth, that Jews fleeing Hitler deserved protection, and most of them didn't get it. There was a famous meeting in the late 1930s, which they gathered. They knew there was this problem. They said, all right, we'll get all the states together. We'll try to divide up. How many will you commit to take? And the answer was none, except for the Dominican Republic, where there was a dictator, Trujillo, who was taking some for that was the only case of all the other countries said, no, we're not taking any refugees. So some will object there's no refugee situation today that compares with Hitler's Germany, which there's a lot of truth in that, but we should be wary of taking easy comfort in such a view, imagining that we would never act as our predecessors did. So if you look at the responses to the Jewish refugees in the late 1930s, it's striking how many echoes you hear of contemporary concerns and attitudes. So remember, at this time the death camps had not yet been built. The Nazi regime had not yet committed itself to the final solution. Everyone knew the Jews were suffering, but there were differing perceptions about the extent of their oppression. And some of those opposed to admitting Jewish refugees were simply overtly anti-Semitic, but many people took a view that went something more like this. Well, what's happening to the Jews is too bad, but it's not our fault. We have our own problems, right? If we take in all the Jews who want to come, we'll be overwhelmed. There's simply too many of them. And besides, while Jews may be subject to discrimination and occasional acts of violence, things aren't as bad as their supporters claim. They exaggerate the problem. Many of the Jews really just want better economic opportunities than they now have at home. In fact, the ones who managed to make it to North America to seek asylum, they can't be among the worst off because they've been able to pay for a boat passage, right, to cross the Atlantic. And times are tough here. It's still the Depression, right? We have an obligation to look out for our own needy first. A large influx of Jews could also be a cultural and political threat. They don't share our religious traditions or our democratic values. Some of them are communists and pose a basic security threat. Some of the people who claim to be fleeing persecution may really be Nazi agents trying to get into our country so they can undermine it from within. You think I'm making that up, but actually it was a very high-level American official who made that exact precise argument. So it's hard to be sure which ones are commies or Nazis, so better to err on the side of caution and not let any of them in, right? Many of them have shown they don't really respect the law. Why? Because they've bribed officials abroad for exit permits and travel papers. They've purchased forged documents. They've hired smugglers to transport them illegally. And they've lied to our immigration officials. And finally, admitting Jewish refugees serves the Nazis' own goals. It doesn't help us to address the underlying problem that gave rise to the Nazi phenomenon. Sound familiar? In some respects, of course, many of the concerns about Jewish refugees then were as reasonable as comparable concerns about refugees are today. There was debate and uncertainty about the extent of the risks facing Jews in Hitler's Germany in the late 1930s. Those who were able to travel to North America were economically better off on average. Some Jews were communists. Some did bribe officials and forge documents and hire smugglers. And not all the people who turned away died in the Holocaust, though many did. The potential number of refugees was very large. Admitting Jewish refugees would not have solved the problems of the Nazis. All of that is true, and yet, despite all these facts, I take it to be incontestable that the response of democratic states to Jewish refugees during the 1930s was a profound moral failure, something we should acknowledge as a shameful moment of our histories and resolve never to repeat. So, we often gain our most important moral insights not from theory but from experience, and I propose to use this terrible failure to accept Jewish refugees as a constraint upon our thinking about our responsibilities towards refugees today. Whatever principles we propose, we should always ask ourselves at some point, well, what would this have meant if we had applied it to Jews fleeing Hitler? And no answer will be acceptable if, in applied to the past, it will lead to the conclusion that it was justifiable to deny safe haven to Jews trying to escape the Nazis. This approach won't solve every question, but it will give us a kind of a minimum standard, a fixed point on our moral compass. Okay, remember, in addressing the question of refugees, I'm working within the constraints of what I've called the conventional view, the assumption that states are normally entitled to exercise discretionary control over immigration. So that, again, that might seem surprising at first glance, but think about it. The idea that refugees have special moral claims to admission implicitly assumes the conventional view. Most people aren't entitled to get in. These people are, because they've got a special claim. So it treats the obligation of states to admit refugees as an exception to the general rule that states are free to control entry and settlement. Okay, so why should democratic states take in refugees at all? So here I think it's helpful to distinguish first between refugees whose plights we're responsible for and refugees whose plights we're not really responsible for. So you might think clearly we have a responsibility to find homes and permanent solutions for refugees who've had to flee because of things that we did. And Americans, whether supporters or opponents of the Vietnam War, recognized this in the wake of the war and took in hundreds of thousands of refugees from Southeast Asia, as did Canada, which was not in the same way responsible. But Americans, as I say, Americans on both sides recognized this moral claim. And of course, Americans have the same sort of obligation towards refugees from Iraq and Afghanistan, especially those who have been forced to flee because their lives are in danger as a result of their cooperation with Americans. And sadly, it's a deep moral failure that Americans have done so little in this regard. And again, that's an issue that should have nothing to do with whether you think that war was a good idea, whether you support or oppose that war at the outset. This responsibility engages. But Americans aren't the only ones with this sort of responsibility. All rich countries have responsibility for refugee flows that we can already foresee. So we should already be starting to think about who ought to take in environmental refugees. People forced to flee their homes because of the effects of climate change. We know this is coming in large numbers. Clearly, the rich industrial states bear a major responsibility for the changes that are already taking place in the environment. It's our responsibility, not those of the neighboring states or even of the home states, to find a place for these people to live. Now, I should say, here as elsewhere, given the divergence between what justice requires and what serves our interests, I'm not optimistic about the likelihood of our meeting the responsibilities I'm sketching out here, but the point is, in a philosophical inquiry like this one, you want to tell the truth, even if you think it's not likely to be accepted or adopted. Okay, but there may be situations in which we're not responsible for the refugees, right? And even if we are not responsible for the fact that refugees have had to flee, we may still have moral obligations to respond to their needs and to offer them a new place to live. And this is an important thing to see, because sometimes people want to emphasize, say, take Syria. You know, well, it's the Americans' fault that Syria's collapsed. Well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But things like this are often disputed. The degree to which you can trace a particular refugee flow to the behavior of particular states is often contested. And what I want to establish is that regardless of how you answer that question, we still have an obligation, even if we are completely innocent, even if we can't be held responsible at all. Canada has had much less of a role in this respect than the United States. We still have responsibilities towards refugees. So again, if you think about the failure of democratic states to respond to the plight of Jews fleeing Hitler as one of the great shames of modern history, it's not that because other states were responsible for the rise of the Nazis. It's because these people were in desperate need and we turned our backs on them. That's the heart of it. So, in the wake of the Holocaust, indeed, we did set up a refugee regime. And this refugee provides help to refugees in two basic ways, asylum and resettlement. But that regime is now in deep trouble, so let me explain why. So first, there's the asylum provisions. So what this says is, under the Geneva Convention, almost all the states have signed on to this, not all, but all the major, certainly all the rich industrial states. If somebody arrives in your state and claims to be a refugee, you're supposed to give that person a fair hearing to see whether or not he or she qualifies as a refugee. And no one should be sent back to a state where their basic human rights are in danger of being violated. Now, there are several problems with this asylum provision, but I'm going to focus just on one, the biggest one, which is that the rich states have made it harder and harder to access the asylum system. So the trick is, you get to make this claim when you arrive in the state's territory. So what do? Any state that is likely to generate refugees, they impose a visa requirement. And if you show up requesting a visa and they think you're likely to make a refugee claim, visa denied, which is, by the way, not accidentally, what happened to Jews in Germany in the 1930s. So you can get a visa to come from one of these refugee-generating states only if you can establish that you've got deep roots there, you've got financial resources, you're going to return. That's what you have to prove to the. Now, sometimes people get away with it, but basically it's a device for screening out. Okay, and by the way, you might think, well, how are they able to enforce this? People get around it. Well, they do it by having huge sanctions on carriers. If you're an airlines and you transport somebody without proper documentation, you pay a huge fine. So they basically get and shipping companies too, they get these transport companies to be the enforcement agents for this exclusionary regime. And so, and this, by the way, is why you get smugglers transporting refugees. Is if people could just get on a plane and come, they wouldn't pay a smuggler. It's a lot cheaper to just pay the airfare, but they have to get smugglers because they can't get in legally. So here's the basic point here. You can't claim to have addressed the refugee problem if you set up a regime to protect refugees and then you prevent the refugees from accessing the regime. It seems pretty obvious, but it needs statement that basically is what we've done in the asylum case. Okay, so now think about resettlement. When refugees flee their home, what should they get and who should provide it? So in the short term, the answer to that is what they need is safety and sustenance above all else. But in the long term, that's not enough. They need a new home. So let's distinguish the short term and the long term. Now, when refugees flee, they tend to go to the neighboring state first because most refugees flee by land. The neighboring state is close, so they wind up in a refugee camp in a neighboring state. And in most cases, the neighboring state is not itself responsible for the crisis that's led people to flee. So you can't say, well, that's their job. They haven't done anything. So you think about Turkey, you think about Lebanon, think about Jordan. They've got millions of refugees. They didn't cause these crises that have generated these. Huh?
Not Turkey. Turkey is responsible.
Well, but not necessarily responsible for many of the refugees who have wound up in Turkey from Iran and Iraq. I'm not saying. So one of the interesting things, some states like Iran is both a refugee-generating country and a refugee-receiving country. So I'm not saying Turkey is blameless. I'm just saying that most of the refugees who wind up in Turkey are not there as a result of Turkey's policies and practices. So they wind up in the neighboring state, and that's probably a reasonable arrangement because that's where people are going to go. And in the short term, as I say, what they need is safety and security. Refugee camps can, in principle, provide that. I should add that real refugee camps are actually very dangerous places and often very poorly supported. So that's a problem as to how it's actually implemented. But you can see that the idea of having short-term solution to refugee camp. It's like any natural disaster or something. This is, you create tents, you solve these problems with some kind of short-term emergency crisis. That's okay, especially if the states that are neighboring aren't expected to bear all the cost of that, because, again, why should they bear the cost? Those costs should be shared by the rest of the world, and especially by those who have the most resources. But that's certainly not a solution in the long term. It's one thing to ask people to put up with these conditions for 3 months or 6 months, but it's not okay to ask them to put up with them for years and years, as people do. They live, sometimes generations grow up in refugee camps. So that's simply not reasonable. So what they need is a new home where they can enter society, get a job, get an education, where they can have a normal life on the terms of that society. And here the point is, there's no reason why the neighboring states should be the ones to provide this. They just happen to be there. They've got no response. This is a responsibility that has to be shared among all states. Now, what are the criteria for sharing? Well, you could argue about this one way or another. The people have advanced different things. Obviously, Canada, which is has 1/10 of the population of the United States, shouldn't be expected to take the same number as the United States, and so on. Size of the population matters. The resource people often, so land might matter, urban density, although people often say, oh, Canada's got all this land, but are people actually going to live in most of it? They can't, So really it's a question of where people can live that's relevant. So economic capacity, capacity to take people in, social capacity in various ways, these things matter. Where the refugees want to go, these things matter. So there are lots of different criteria which we could sort out if we were committed to trying to figure out a fair system for where refugees should go. And there'd be dispute and reasonable disagreements, and you could have arguments, but nobody's willing to do that. I mean, it'd be completely speculative at this point to talk about what that fair system would be, because none of the rich states, as we can see now, there are exceptions. Germany has taken in a lot, right, in the recent past. Canada's, compared with others, pretty good, 70, 50, 75,000, but compared with what we could do and should do. So it's an interesting kind of problem of presentation and politics in a way. You don't want to discourage, again, think about how many, Trudeau saying, let's take in 50,000 Syrian refugees, when the Americans, 10 times as large, are taking in 10,000, and not even them. So you want to encourage that, right? That was a risky political move. He made it. That's good. But, why 50,000? Why not 500,000? We could do that too. So it's a kind of puzzle about how you want to talk about these things. On the one hand, because people often get praised, the moral standards become compared with what other people are doing. So this is great compared with what other people were doing, but that's only because what other people are doing is so miserable that this looks pretty good. And if you stacked it up against maybe what we really should do, it wouldn't look so good. And there's a kind of political problem about how you talk about that, and when it's appropriate to criticize and when it's appropriate to support, because there are certainly people, in Canada as elsewhere, as we know, who say, let's not take in any. So you have to be a little careful about. But again, as an academic, what you can say is that nobody is really doing enough. Maybe Germany taking in 1 million, you might say. It's got 80 million people. Although, so Lebanon's taken in 1 million, it's got 4 million people. So it depends on, who's doing what. And here's one of the problems that you face in the refugee case, which people often find puzzling, is that, they don't want to be suckers. We're taking in 1 million, nobody else is doing it, and I guess we're suckers, we shouldn't take in so many. Well, the very nature of the refugee problem is that you have to pick up the slack because somebody else hasn't done what they should do, which is the original state. So the whole assumption here is people belong in their own state. But you have refugees when people can't live safely in their own states. So that state has failed. That's where the first responsibility is, right? And so now we're having to do something, in the best case, we're not responsible for it. Okay, so what if now, state A and state B says, and I'm not taking any. Should we take the ones that state B should have taken? Well, at some level, what's the alternative? Are you going to let them die? So it seems to me when you get these debates, which are often debates about, we're doing our share, what are the compare? People are just not asking themselves, so what actually is it that you're expecting to happen to these people if you don't step up? And they just want to kind of turn their eyes away from that. So again, in the debates, you see these concerns about security or costs or whatever. Are they saying they won't announce, yeah, let them die, but they're just counting maybe on the neighboring, on the Turkeys, the Lebanons, and you start to see some of these states starting to say, you know what, nobody else is going to do, we're going to turn them away too. So in Turkey's case, for example, they have in some cases put soldiers at the borders. Turn away the refugees. You have to stay. We're not letting you in. Lebanon, Jordan, they face these pressures. So again, you know, there has to be some story that you tell about what it is. If you're going to say no, I want to hear the story you're telling about what you expect to happen to these people and why you think that's okay. Okay. So the short version is the rich states of Europe and North America have not done nearly enough in addressing the problem of refugees. And I think that's just transparently obvious. So up to this point, I've been exploring the ethics of immigration. As I say, within the constraints of the conventional view, states get to exercise discretionary control. And in talking about irregular migrants and refugees, that qualifies it, but it doesn't really challenge it directly. As I said, the refugee discussion assumes this is the normal thing. But now let's think about a challenge to the conventional view. So why might somebody think, as I do, that a commitment to democratic principles should lead rich states to open their borders much more fully? Okay, so here's the story. Borders have guards, and the guards have guns. Now, this is an obvious fact of political life, but it's one that's easily hidden from view. I don't know if you do we notice this in the airport and you're passing through? Do you really notice the guns? Do you think of those guns as aimed at you or trying to protect you? Those of us who are citizens of affluent democracies, if we see the guards at all, we find them reassuring. We think of them as there to protect us rather than to keep us out, right? The Africans in small leaky vessels seeking to avoid patrol boats while they cross the Mediterranean to southern Europe, the Mexicans willing to risk death from heat and exposure in the Arizona desert to evade the fences and border controls, it's quite different. To these people, the borders, the guards, the guns are all too apparent. Their goal of exclusion, all too real. But what justifies the use of force against such people? Perhaps borders and guards can be justified as a way of keeping out terrorists or armed invaders or criminals, but most of those trying to get in are not like that. They're ordinary, peaceful people, seeking only the opportunity to build decent, secure lives for themselves and their families. On what moral grounds can we deny entry to these sorts of people? What gives anyone the right to point guns at them? Now, to many people, the answer to this question will seem obvious. They'll say, well, the power to admit or exclude non-citizens is inherent in sovereignty, essential for any political community that seeks to exercise self-determination. Every state has the legal and moral right to exercise control over admissions in pursuit of its own national interest and of the common good of the members of its community, even if that means denying entry to peaceful, needy foreigners. States can choose to be generous in admitting immigrants, but in most cases, at least, they're under no moral obligation to do so. So, bracketing the refugees question. So that's the view I want to challenge. In principle, I want to say borders should generally be open and people should normally be free to leave their country of origin and settle wherever they choose. I think this critique of exclusion has particular force with respect to restrictions on movement from developing states to Europe and North America, but in fact it applies more generally. So in many ways, citizenship in Western democracies is the modern equivalent of feudal class privilege. It's an inherited status that greatly enhances one's life chances. To be born a citizen of a rich state in Europe and North America is a lot like being born into the nobility. Admittedly, many of us are in the lesser nobility, but still. To be born a citizen of a poor country in Asia or Africa is like being born into the peasantry in the Middle Ages, even if there are a few rich peasants and some peasants manage to gain entry to the nobility. Like feudal birthright privileges, contemporary social arrangements not only grant great advantages on the basis of birth, but also entrench these advantages by legally restricting mobility, making it very hard for those born into a socially disadvantaged position to overcome that disadvantage, no matter how talented they are or how hard they work. And like feudal practices, these contemporary social arrangements are hard to justify when you think about them closely. See, reformers in the late Middle Ages objected to the way feudalism restricted freedom, including the freedom of individuals to move from one place to another in search of a better life, a constraint that was crucial to the maintenance of the feudal system. You couldn't go to move from one town to another, you couldn't move from one land to another without permission. You had to get the permission of the lords. So modern practices of state control over borders tie people to the land of their birth almost as effectively. So limiting entry to rich democratic states is a crucial mechanism for protecting a birthright privilege. And if the feudal practices protecting birthright privileges were wrong, what justifies the modern ones? Kind of assuming no defenders of feudalism here, but again, one of those assumptions. All right. The analogy that I've drawn with feudalism is designed to give you pause about the conventional view that restrictions on immigration by democratic states are normally justified. Now let me outline the positive case for open borders. And I start from three basic assumptions. First, there's no natural social order, something that we construct. The institutions and practices that govern human beings are ones that human beings have created and therefore can change, at least in principle. Not talking about what's immediately politically feasible, but they're not given by God. Second, in evaluating the moral status of alternative forms of political and social organization, we have to start from the premise that all human beings are of equal moral worth. So, contrary to the feudal assumption that some are born noble and some are born peasants, that everybody is of equal moral worth. And so then we have to think about how we're going to justify our arrangements as being in everybody's interest. And third, restrictions on freedom in particular require a moral justification. And I say these are my views, my assumptions, but really these are the assumptions that undergird the claim to moral legitimacy of every contemporary democratic regime. If you try to say, well, what justifies the Canadian political system or the American political, they're all going to appeal to things like this. Well, we treat people equally, we're going to protect freedoms. They're going to appeal to these basic norms and values, right? We've constructed this political system. Now, the assumption that people are of equal moral worth doesn't mean that no legal distinctions can be drawn among different groups of people, and the requirement that restrictions on freedom be justified doesn't mean coercion is never defensible, but these two assumptions, along with the one that social order is not naturally given, means we have to give reasons for our institutions and practices. And those reasons have to take a certain form. It's never enough to justify a set of social arrangements governing human beings to say, well, these arrangements are good for us, without regard for others, whoever the us may be. I'm always reminded here when I read this sentence, there's a cartoon in the New Yorker. It shows these two kings. I have this on my door, actually. It shows these two kings chatting with one another. They got their little crowns on, and one says to the other, monarchy may not be the best system of government in principle, but it has always seemed the best system of government for me. Which is sort of what we say about, how we've structured things. Good for us, isn't it? Yeah, well, so. Well, in principle, we should be appealing to things that take everyone's interests into account, or explain why social arrangements are reasonable and fair to everyone who is subject to them. Okay, so if you accept these three assumptions, then there's at least a prima facie case that borders should be open for three interrelated reasons. First, state control over immigration limits freedom of movement. And the right to go where you want is an important human freedom in itself. It's just this freedom and all that it makes possible that's taken away by imprisonment, for example. Freedom of movement is a prerequisite to many other freedoms. If people are free to live their lives as they choose, so long as this doesn't interfere with the legitimate claims of others, they have to be free to move where they want. And I don't mean anyone can go anywhere. I mean the kind of freedom that we enjoy within the state. So think about this concretely. You're in Toronto. Suppose you want to go to Montreal or to Vancouver. What do you have to do? Whose permission do you have to get? Well, I don't know. Nobody's really, right? You have to come up with the money for the transport. You have to obey the laws, in principle as you go. But you don't have to ask any government official, is this okay with you? Right? And they don't have any discretion to say, oh, we don't want you to come here. Right? So that's a kind of freedom. And even if you never go to these places, the fact that you have that freedom, it matters. It matters to kind of how you see yourself and what the scope of your opportunities are. So, well, what's the magic of... But if you want to go to Boston, or if you want to go to Paris, you've got to get somebody's permission. Now, maybe it's all routinized. You don't have to get a visa in advance because the governments have sorted that. But in principle, you don't have the same kind of entitlement. Well, why? So what is the magic of the state as constraining those things? That means you've got to, and in fact, it's enshrined in human rights documents. It's an international human right that says you should have freedom of movement within the state. So even if there are good reasons why a state might want to restrict movement from one place to another, it's not entitled to do so because that's a basic human right. So that freedom of movement within the state is so important. What about freedom of movement between states? Why isn't that equally important? Yeah.
Within every state or just within your state?
You are free to move within any person present within a state, at least lawfully present, is free to move within that state. So I'm saying the logic is all the reasons why you make that a human right and say even though the state may have good policy. So for example, China wanted to reduce the pattern of urbanization, slow it down, and it actually has imposed constraints, and it gets criticized as violating the human rights thing. So there, or think about, in Canada and the United States, you have provinces with lots of power. So one province may decide we're going to put in a very sturdy welfare regime. Well, then what about people moving from the ones with lousy systems to that? Won't they take advantage? Oh, well, so keep them out. No, you don't get to do that. Even though now, so we say, if you think about, one of the arguments against immigration is it'll destroy the welfare state. But inside a country where the welfare is the responsibility of provinces or of states in the small sense, that's not a sufficient justification for exclusion. So why is it okay in one case and not in the other? So it's just a presupposition that we have. It's very interesting to me about this particular thing that it's so built in that people think that you have to justify the right to cross borders. And so when you're inside, it's the freedom that's the presupposition. When you're outside, somehow it's flipped. I tell this story that some of you have seen the movie The Shawshank. How many of you have seen The Shawshank Redemption? Oh, lots. Okay. So there's this wonderful scene. I don't know if you remember this. So Morgan Freeman, who's this character, he's been in prison for many years, and now he's finally got out, and he's working in a store. And he says, boss, can I go use the bathroom? He says, well, yeah, you don't have to ask me permission to use the bathroom. And you can see a light goes on in his head. He realizes that he has internalized the constraints of prison, where you have to ask permission for everything that you do. And that even though he's technically free, he's not really free until he can let go of that. So my view is that we've internalized this kind of constraint, the assumption that the state gets to exclude, so that we're operating, we're not even aware of the way that imprisons our minds. So a second reason, one reason for having open borders is freedom. A second reason is, and there's not much more to go, second reason is equality of opportunity. So within democratic states, we all recognize in principle that access to social positions should be determined by, in principle, we don't follow this in practice, by an individual's actual talents and efforts, not limited on the basis of birth-related characteristics like class or race or gender that aren't relevant to the capacity to perform well in that position. And that's intimately linked to the idea that all human beings are of equal moral worth. We used to say, African Americans need not apply, and that wasn't the term, or Irish need not apply, women need not apply. The idea is there's no natural hierarchies of birth that entitle people to advantageous social positions. Again, kind of democratic principles. But you have to be able to move to where the opportunities are in order to take advantage of them. So freedom of movement is an essential prerequisite for equality of opportunity. And it's in the linkage between freedom of movement and equality of opportunity that the analogy with feudalism cuts most deeply. See, under feudalism, there was no commitment to equality of opportunity. The social circumstances of your birth largely determined your opportunities, and restrictions on freedom of movement were an essential element in maintaining the limitations on the opportunities of those with talent and motivation but the wrong class background. And of course, gender was another pervasive constraint. In the modern world, we've created a social order where there is a commitment to equality of opportunity for people within democratic states, at least to some extent, but no pretense of it or even aspiration to it for people across states. The state's discretionary control over immigration means that the opportunities for people in one state are just closed to those from another for the most part. And since the range of opportunities vary so much from one state to another, this means that in our world, as in feudalism, the social circumstances of your birth largely determine your opportunities. And restrictions on freedom of movement are an essential element in maintaining this arrangement. That is to say, limiting the opportunities of people with talents and motivations but the wrong social circumstances of birth. And again, the challenge for those who would defend restrictions on immigration is to justify the resulting inequalities of opportunity. Why is it okay to set up the world in this way? Why is that just? Now, that's a separate question from what we should do about it. Once you recognize this is problematic, it might not be the case that the best way to address it is to dismantle the existing system right away and just have chaos. Okay, I can buy that. But the question is, what justifies the existing arrangement? If you don't have a story about what justifies the existing arrangement, then you've got a problem. So a third closely related point is that a commitment to equal moral worth entails some commitment to economic, social, and political equality, partly as a means of realizing freedom and equal opportunity, but partly as a desirable end in itself. Freedom of movement would contribute to a reduction of existing political, social, and economic inequalities. There are millions of people in poor states today who long for the freedom and economic opportunity they could find in Europe and North America. Many of them take great risks to come, and if the borders were open, millions more would move. The exclusion of so many poor and desperate people seems hard to justify from a perspective that takes seriously the claims of all individuals as free and equal moral persons. Now, I have no illusions about the likelihood of rich states actually opening their borders. The primary motivation for this open borders argument is my sense that it's of vital importance to gain a critical perspective on the ways in which our collective choices are constrained, even when we can't do anything to alter those constraints. Social institutions and practices may be deeply unjust, but so firmly established that for all practical purposes they have to be taken as background givens in deciding how to act in the world at a given moment. For example, feudalism and slavery were social arrangements that were deeply entrenched in places in the past. In those contexts, there was no hope of transcending them in a foreseeable future, but criticism was still appropriate. So even if we take existing arrangements as given for purposes of immediate action in a particular context, we should never forget about the assessment of their fundamental character. Otherwise, we wind up legitimating what should only be endured. Of course, most people in democratic states think that the institutions they inhabit have nothing in common with feudalism and slavery, as we hear. From a normative perspective, the social arrangements of democratic states, they suppose, are just. Well, nearly so. And it's that complacency that the open borders argument is intended to undermine. Precisely that. For I imagine, or at least I hope, that in a century or two, people will look back upon our world with bafflement or shock, just as we wonder about the blindness of feudal aristocrats and southern slave owners. Future generations may ask themselves how Democrats today could possibly have failed to see the deep injustice of a world so starkly divided between haves and have-nots, and why we felt so complacent about this division, so unwilling to do what we could to change it. So the argument for open borders provides one way of bringing this deep injustice of the modern world into view. Now, it's only a partial perspective, to be sure, because even if borders were open, that would not address all of the underlying injustices that make people want to move. But it's a useful perspective, because our responsibility for keeping people from immigrating is clear and direct, whereas our responsibility for poverty and oppression elsewhere is often not as obvious, at least to many people. Now, I think it's there, but it's harder to prove. We have to use force to keep people from moving. We need borders with barriers and guards with guns to keep out people whose only goal is to work hard to build a decent life for themselves and their children. And that is something we could change. At the least, we could let many more people in. Our refusal to do so is a choice that we make, and one that keeps many of them from having a chance at a decent life. That's it.